When we analyse a series as long-lived as Song of Ice and Fire, we have to keep in mind the historical context of the published books. Song of Ice and Fire manages to feel timeless in a way that few other pieces of fiction manage, but no art can be entirely divorced from the context it was created in. For the first three books, that was the late 1990s, and the deceptively settled order they take as a starting point seems reflective of Martin's concerns with that end of history moment. The next two books were released in 2005 and 2011 consecutively, and between them do a lot of work setting up the pieces for events that are still yet to take place in the series. If we do ever get to read The Winds of Winter, therefore, in whatever year it might come out, we will be reading a book that was in some ways written, or at least had some of its plot points conceived of at the height of the global war on terror. The events of the early 2000s, the September 11th attacks and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq that followed, and the broader conflict known as the global war on terror, are reflected in numerous ways in the latter two A Song of Ice and Fire books. Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons are the most skeptical of war of the series, skeptical of war as a grand narrative focused on the cycle of violence and revenge, aware of the toll war takes on those fighting it. In contrast to the other books, these two take place where, at least temporarily, the bulk of the fighting is over. A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons slow down to focus on the aftermath of Daenerys' conquest of Slaver's Bay, of the War of the Five Kings in the Riverlands, and of the battles by the Wall. They focus on the attempts to make settlements to deal with combatants still in the field or captured by the victors, and with how and by who territory will be governed in the future. Daenerys' story in Meereen, in A Dance with Dragons in particular, focuses on the troubles faced by an outsider attempting to rule over a Middle East-coded location, the tension between respecting entrenched traditions and imposing your values in an attempt to improve lives, a violent insurgency, and the lengths the occupying power will go to stop it. The role of religion also suddenly jumps in importance in the latter two books. We hear about Daenerys' religious role in the Fatal Valor, as well as the Sparrows, and the High Sparrow in particular emerges as a dangerous religious extremist appealing to the dispossessed with a message of violence and fundamentalist religion. With this in mind, can we foresee how this influence might go forward into The Winds of Winter? Like I said before, the basis for the whole of what we do here, making theories for A Song of Ice and Fire, is the assumption that Martin, or more broadly any writer, is writing ahead of themselves. That is, he's planting foreshadowing in the material that has been released for events or information that is not yet present in the current material. We're working on that foreshadowing to then go on and say it's pointing to the author planning a certain plot point in a hypothetical future book, for example. So that context doesn't just influence Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, it will also influence any hypothetical future installment. So yes, I think if we look at the elements being set up for The Winds of Winter, it can allow us to do a little informed speculation. The question of who will burn King's Landing or how King's Landing will be destroyed is one that gets discussed a lot. It's something we have as a plot point for the TV show, a major plot point that we as fans of the books have to grapple with. Is this something Martin was originally planning for a future installment? A lot of theorists online have reasons to think this plot point belongs to Jon Conington, not Daenerys. When we see it happen in the TV show, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for Daenerys' character, either in the show or as it stands in the books. And so the thinking goes that this is a plot beat taken from the books, but because Jon Conington doesn't exist in the same way, was given to Daenerys. But if we do think it's going to be Jon Conington that destroys King's Landing, the specific situation is not clear. We often have this theory settle on Jon Conington as an instigator, but the why of it never seems to be satisfactory. It's often something like Jon Conington goes crazy, he loses control, he's affected by his grayscale, etc., etc. Central to the identification of Jon Conington is the line of speculation that links the bells of the TV show with Jon Conington's grievance, his trauma over the Battle of Stony Sept, the so-called Battle of the Bells. And we have this quote: "Last night he dreamt of Stony Sept again. Alone with sword in hand, he ran from house to house, smashing down doors, racing upstairs, leaping from roof to roof, as his ears rang to the sound of distant bells. Deep bronze booms and silver chiming pounded through his skull, a maddening cacophony of noise that grew ever louder until it seemed as if his head would explode. 17 years had come and gone since the Battle of the Bells, yet the sound of bells ringing still tied a knot in his guts." We have heard about the Battle of Stony Sept before, A Dance with Dragons, but it's only with the addition of John Conington's POV in 2011 that we see this aspect of trying to track down a hidden enemy amongst the civilian population again. And so he swept down on Stony Sept, closed off the town, and began a search. His knights went house to house, smashed in every door, peered into every cellar. He had even sent men crawling through the sewers, yet somehow Robert still eluded him. The townsfolk were hiding him. They moved him from one secret bolt hole to the next, always one step ahead of the king's men. The whole town was a nest of traitors. The question of how far to go, how do you fight an enemy amongst the civilian population, all these are questions originating from the early 2000s context of the book. This is, in fact, the particular question that John Conington's arc is seemingly teetering on. His famous line, "I failed the father, I won't fail the son," is in this context. Conington remembers saying Tywin Lannister could have done no more in regards to Stony Sept, and we get this remembrance in response. "There is where you're wrong," Miles Toyne had replied. "Lord Tywin would not have bothered with a search. He would have burnt down that town, every living creature in it." So when John Conington says, "I won't fail the son," he means next time he wants to burn the whole town down. This is also what the ticking clock of his grayscale is hurtling him towards. He's a man running out of time. He has to have quick victories, decisive victories. He can't fight a long, prolonged guerrilla conflict. And so it's setting him hurtling towards exactly this kind of brutal expediency. With all this being said then, if Martin is setting up Conington to face down against a hidden enemy, there's one very clear candidate in the context of this global war on terror influence we've been speaking about. I think there's something of a consensus that Aegon will take King's Landing in the Winds of Winter, and of course King's Landing is the focal centre for another plot thread that seemingly appears in response to the events of the early 2000s, the rise of the Faith Militant under the charismatic leadership of the High Sparrow. If John Conington is going to be in that situation again of facing an enemy, perhaps to go over the edge this time, it's reasonable to think his enemies will be religious extremists, the religious extremists of the Sparrows amongst the civilian population. And if he's looking for someone going door to door, perhaps it will be the austere religious scholar, the High Sparrow. I don't think I need to tell you how this is evocative of the War on Terror, the hunt for Osama bin Laden in the Tora Bora Mountain Cave Complex, and in particular the Second Battle of Fallujah, would have been on TV screens as these events were being set up in the author's mind. In particular, Second Fallujah, we see this case of locking down the city to locate insurgents and a particular leader that conjures up those same images of soldiers going house to house, kicking in doors. It's, in fact, one of the enduring images of the 2000s time period when these last two books were written. The wildfire that will be involved in this complication is evocative, yes, of Greek fire, but also of the napalm of the Vietnam War and the white phosphorus of Fallujah, for example, or perhaps the colossal airstrikes on Tora Bora. Wildfire is also sort of a dragonless mirroring of what's done with a dragon. That is to say, when Daenerys also deals with her own insurgency in the Harpy, the Sons of the Harpy, it's probably going to involve dragons in some way, like we saw in the TV show. Daenerys and Aegon are two characters who mirror each other among the many different pairings in the series. Aegon's conquest can be seen as Daenerys' conquest come early. This is what she would be experiencing if she hadn't turned aside to Sabre's Bay, and so it's to be expected that Aegon has some of the same problems she does ruling in Sabre's Bay. Aegon is going in without the lessons Daenerys has learned in her own arc about the real difficulties of rule, and also without her dragons. That is to say, the wildfire is a substitute for the dragons. So we can say that Aegon will also experience an insurgency against his conquest, but in Westeros, in King's Landing. And John Conington will burn King's Landing in a confrontation with that insurgency, with that threat, like Cersei's TV show blowing up the set. Blowing up all the characters involved is probably a clue that this is how the plotline concludes. This was the TV writers wrapping it up with the characters they did have, because there was no more road for that particular storyline to go down. Now the role of the bells becomes more clear. They're the bells of septs, specifically the equivalent of churches. Martin is already setting Conington up for a religious conflict. He's foreshadowing that conflict with this backstory. We have to ask, if bells do trigger some kind of decision from Conington, will they be ringing as a signal to a religious uprising or in some kind of religious protest? We can think of, for example, the medieval inspiration of the Sicilian Vespers, when a religious hour was used as the timing for an uprising and massacre in Sicily. And this development is already foreshadowed in A Fire and Blood, with the character that most presages the High Sparrow. That's the shepherd who causes the riots in King's Landing. I think this is George R. R. Martin showing us retrospectively that these kind of problems with the faith have occurred before and where exactly they can lead. And this character of the shepherd more directly calls out the influence of the Shepherd's Crusade or the Shepherd's Crusades, two comparable events in the 13th and 14th century in France that kind of draw a direct line between that inspiration and the sparrows and the character of the High Sparrow. But specifically in A Fire and Blood, this is a scenario in which a ruler comes in for a brief period and has an initial burst of popularity, but that support quickly sours over a short period, with discontent fomented by a charismatic religious figure. I think they call Rhaenyra the half-year queen or something like that, which kind of tallies with how long Aegon is expected to be in power in King's Landing. We can see something like this happening with Aegon, who we think initially will be popular because of the vision of the Mummish Dragon, which likely references him, showing crowds cheering him on and so on. We can then expect this initial popularity turns to unpopularity based around the issue of religion. It's hard to speculate on what exactly the point of contention will be, but this contest between temporal and spiritual lordship is a classic of the Middle Ages and also of Fire and Blood, of George's backstory for the Targaryens. That modus vivendi between the Targaryens' particular traditions and the faith's beliefs is shown to have taken a very long time to build, to come about in Fire and Blood. There's no reason to assume the faith would willingly just step back into it as the Golden Company takes King's Landing. So if the High Sparrow is like his predecessor going to preach that the dragons were demons, the spawn of godless Valyria, and the doom of men, etc., etc., John Conington is being set up to step into a conflict echoing the themes of the early 2000s. We've already seen influencing the previous two books: religious extremism, the lines between civilian and combatant, the difficulty of establishing a lasting peace after a military victory. This will be a conflict where his past trauma and his motivations are all setting him up to make that monstrous decision we know is coming. Alright, that's everything I have to say. What do you think? What do you think about the time period these books were written in? Do you think it's had any effect on the series so far, and do you think it's going to have an effect on the books in the future? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like the video, and you can hype it. You can hype the video below.